Okay, a procedural solution. Actually, before we start that, let's just look at how we got to that last section. Okay, so of course we have Mrs. Smith. The first thing that we investigated were the methods for making a decision about what to do about her care, whether or not to continue life-sustaining treatment, methods to make that decision based on what we think the patient would want if she were somehow suddenly able to tell us. And so we tried to figure that out based on her prior values and then also based on her current behavior. Okay, so both of those methods for figuring out whether or not we should continue life-sustaining treatment run into problems. So then we tried using a best interest test. But for someone like Mrs. Smith, at least according to Arras, it doesn't work that well. Okay, so that brings us to the procedural solution, and this is going to be the one that Arras himself endorses. Okay, so according to lawyer bioethicist Nancy Roden, the problem lies not in our inability to come up with better evidence of a patient's wishes or level of pain and suffering, but rather in the questions we are asking. She argues convincingly that both the substituted judgment and best interest tests set the standard of evidence far too high. By requiring clear and convincing evidence either that a patient's prior values would dictate the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment or that the burdens of a patient's life outweigh the benefits, these tests establish a standard that cannot realistically be met by the kinds of evidence we are likely to have at our disposal. As we have seen, in the absence of a carefully drafted living will, a durable power of attorney, or severe and intractable pain, it will rarely be clear either that a patient would have refused treatment or that death is in her best interests. Given the usual evidentiary materials, that is the usual evidence at hand, in most cases, the best we can do is conclude that foregoing treatment is probably what the patient would have wanted or that death is likely to be in the patient's best interest, although we will never know for sure in either case. To be sure, there are some easy cases where a patient's best interests are clearly and perceptibly being violated. For example, greedy relatives might request the termination of treatment that could realistically return the patient to a good quality of life, or guilt-ridden relatives might press for full resuscitative measures, that is, resuscitating the patient who's dead or close to death, on a moribund patient riddled with metastatic cancer. But apart from such clear-cut cases of unmistakable undertreatment and overtreatment, most of the truly problematical cases, like Mrs. Smith's, fall into a vast gray area between these extremes where the patient's best interests will remain unclear and largely inscrutable. Okay, so we'll get into this on this page, but just to give you the picture now, so the gray area is the area in between these two kinds of cases. These two kinds of cases are not in the gray area is between them. So on one side, we have moribund patients riddled with metastatic cancer, or Mrs. Jones. So these patients are not in the gray area. They're outside the gray area in the zone of non-treatment, or that's the zone where it's clearly morally acceptable to stop life-sustaining treatment for these patients. On the other side of the gray area are patients who would have a good quality of life, like Mr. Black. So they might be impaired in any number of ways, but they can still have a decent quality of life, and so they are outside the gray area, and they're in the zone where clearly they should be given life-sustaining treatment. Okay, so most of the truly problematical cases, like Mrs. Smith's, fall into a vast gray area. Our problem then is that we have been asking questions for which there exist, in most of the hard cases at least, no clearly correct answers. Rodin's solution, in which I concur, is to bypass this substantive impasse with a procedural solution, taking her cue from the President's Commission report. So that was from 1983. You don't need to worry about what it is, except that what Arras is saying here is partially based on what was in this report. Okay, so taking her cue from the President's Commission report addressed to the problem of severely impaired newborns, she argues that when a proposed course of action falls into the gray area of uncertainty, involved and well-intentioned family members should have the discretion to decide as they see fit. Okay, so the question is, what do we do? How do we make a decision for patients that fall, like Mrs. Smith, who fall in the gray area? Okay, so the answer to that is, for patients who are in the gray area, involved and well-intentioned family members should have the discretion to decide as they see fit. So for someone like Mrs. Smith, she has her son and daughter who are involved, do care about her. Since Mrs. Smith falls into the gray area, then they should simply, they should have reasons for their decision, but they, the son and the daughter, should simply be able to decide whether or not to continue life-sustaining treatment or not. Okay, so presumably the involved and well-intentioned family members will invoke precisely the same kinds of evidence bearing on the patient's value system, religious affiliation, quality of life, and the potential benefits and burdens of treatment, but they would not be held to a standard of evidence requiring that their choices be uniquely correct. To be sure, many caring and well-meaning family members will also want to weigh the impact of continued treatment upon themselves and the family unit. Sometimes the ongoing provision of care and treatment to severely demented patients like Mrs. Smith can impose great burdens, both financial and emotional, upon families. I believe that such concerns are, for the most part, inevitable, and that they often subtly color treatment decisions even when officially banished under the auspices of the usual ethical legal standards. This is to be expected, that is, considering the burdens, both emotional and financial, on yourself if life-sustaining treatment is continued for someone like Mrs. Smith. That is to be expected and should not give us grounds for concern so long as the case originally falls within the gray area of ethical ambiguity and so long as the interests of family do not clearly violate the best interests of the patient. The correct question for us then is not whether foregoing treatment is clearly the right answer, but rather whether Mrs. Smith's case falls into the problematical gray area. If it does, then the decision of a trustworthy surrogate, so surrogate just means someone who speaks or acts on behalf of someone else, so here we mean the involved and well-intentioned family members, or maybe it doesn't have to be a family member, but that would be the typical case. The decision of a trustworthy surrogate should prevail over objections from caregivers, that is, from doctors or from the hospital, unless the latter can show a clear violation of best interests of the patient. Since a case must exhibit considerable ethical ambiguity to fall into this gray zone in the first place, we should expect that well-meaning and ethically sensitive people will reach different conclusions about the care of such patients. Okay, so if someone falls within the gray area, whether or not they receive life-sustaining treatment, of course, is going to depend specifically on their own involved and well-intentioned family members. So it's not going to be the case that we get the same exact answer for each patient. Okay, but the opinions of trustworthy surrogates, that is of the involved family members, should be given priority simply because they are usually in the best position to assess the prior wishes and best interests of incompetent patients, and because their familial, that is being part of the family, and emotional bonding to patients usually gives them a greater claim than members of the healthcare team. What then are the boundaries of the gray area? When is a case sufficiently ambiguous to warrant our trust in surrogate decision-making? That is, when are we warranted in letting family members make the decision about continuing or not continuing life-sustaining treatment? We can begin with a reassertion of the Conroy best interest formula. If a patient's capacity for benefiting from continued life appears to be eclipsed by the constant presence of severe and intractable pain, then the case falls either in the gray area or the clear-cut zone of non-treatment. Okay, so if this is the case, severe and intractable pain, then the patient is in the gray area or is outside the gray area on this side. I would add that this imbalance of burdens over benefits need not be conclusively proven by clear and convincing evidence. It should be sufficient merely for the surrogate to make a strong case that the burdens are disproportionate to the benefits. In Mrs. Smith's case, however, no such claim can be made. So she's not going to fall outside the gray area or be in the gray area for this reason. However, in the absence of severe pain, we must ask whether the patient is genuinely capable of benefiting from continued existence. Does she recognize and interact with other persons, including her family and caregivers? Does she have a sufficiently intact self to conceive of the future and to care about what happens in it? If the answers to these questions are negative, even if the patient is capable of some rudimentary physical pleasures, I would argue that the patient has no real interest in continued life or the administration of life-sustaining treatments and thus falls squarely into the gray area. Okay, so you should recognize that the issues here are concern personhood. Is this individual, is this human being still a person? If not, if clearly not, then she's going to be in the gray area, unless she's actually outside the gray area on this side. Okay, Mrs. Smith fits this profile. She is so demented that she cannot recognize family or caregivers. Her memory is so depleted and her sense of self so fractured that she cannot be said to have genuinely human interests. Since the boundaries of this morally ambiguous zone will inevitably correspond to the limits of societal toleration, it will often be helpful to ask what most reasonable people would want for themselves in this circumstance. Although this question is generally not allowed in more patient-centered inquiries into the patient's prior preferences or best interests, it should be allowable here, where we are merely trying to determine whether a case is sufficiently morally problematic to fit into the gray zone. Okay, so the question is what most reasonable people would want for themselves if they were, well, in any particular condition. So in our case, it's Mrs. Smith's condition, but if we had some other patient who we think maybe falls within the gray area, we can ask this question: if most people, most reasonable people, I don't know, in our community or in our society, answer that they would rather die than continue to live in such a physically, emotionally, and socially impoverished state, then that person, that patient, falls within the gray zone, the gray area. Okay, so this isn't specifically telling us what we should do with such a patient. It's just a means of figuring out whether or not a patient falls within the gray zone. If most people would say they wouldn't want to live in that condition, then that patient is in the gray zone, and it goes back to involved and well-intentioned family members to make a decision about continuing life-sustaining treatment. All right, did I even read this whole paragraph? Well, okay, I think I skipped this, but you get the idea. All right, and then fourth, another useful clue is to ask how we would have responded to Mrs. Smith's death from lack of adequate nutrition had it occurred prior to the advent of artificial feeding. Okay, so again, this question we're asking we can apply to any patient, and if we get this answer that we're about to look at, then that patient falls into the gray zone, or maybe even in this case, outside the gray zone, in the zone of non-treatment. But if a patient isn't in the zone of non-treatment, we ask this question and we get this answer, then that patient is in the gray area. Okay, so for any patient or for someone like Mrs. Smith, if her death had occurred prior to the advent of artificial feeding, so she died because implanting a nasogastric tube wasn't an option for delivering calories. Okay, so if she had died for that reason, then no doubt there would have been the inevitable sadness associated with the death of any human being, but there would have been no shock, no outrage, no sense of tragedy, nor even any feeling that the death had deprived her of any real benefits. The predominant response to such a death would most likely have been relief, both for the sake of the patient and for her loved ones. Okay, so what we have here in this column, second column on 943, are 4 ways of determining whether or not a patient falls within the gray area. I won't repeat them, but that's what we have been going through. Then if a patient does fall within the gray area, we let involved and well-intentioned family members decide whether or not life-sustaining treatment should be continued or not. In such cases, that is, cases where we would respond like this if the patient died because we couldn't give them life-sustaining treatment, the only apparent rationale for the imposition of life-sustaining technologies is that since they exist, they must be used. And the more they are used, that is, the more pervasive their presence in hospitals and long-term care facilities, then the more their expanded use assumes the necessity of a moral imperative. That is, we have these technologies. Since we have them, we use them. The more we use them, the more it seems as though using them is morally required. But it is precisely here, in cases such as Mrs. Smith's, that we must pause to ask about the proper use of such technologies. If they do nothing to further the real interests of patients, if all they do is to prolong the biological existence of patients whose biographical lives have long since come to an end, then biomedical technologies assume the status of idols, i.e., inanimate objects worshipped by the human beings who created them, objects that return to dominate us rather than serving our purposes. All right, there we go.